Okay, welcome everyone, dear students, colleagues, and guests. On behalf of the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning of Ghent University, I welcome you to the first online lecture in the series Excursions at Home. My name is Wouter Davids, and I'm your host for tonight. Before introducing our distinguished speaker for tonight, allow me to say a few words on the lecture series that we are kicking off tonight. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are forced to stay home, to study and to work from home. We are obliged to refrain from going out, let alone to travel to distant locations. The impact of this situation is wide and far reaching, and many are affected. And the effects for the daily operations of an architecture program as ours are extensive too. Courses in studios are to be organized via digital platforms, and the daily conversations we have as you students and we as staff members are delegated to the likes of Zoom, Teams, and Skype. Yet what might be one of the most difficult things to be replaced are the excursions that are of such a vital nature within an architecture training. On a yearly basis, the staff and students of the bachelor studios travel to cities and sites in Belgium and abroad to discover, discuss, and visit unexpected, inspiring, and sometimes even disturbing examples of contemporary historical architecture, city development, and urban planning. And on a yearly basis, the master trip brings students and staff to more distant locations, as India, Argentina, and other places, to experience distinct encounters and confrontations with other architectures and cultures. Yet, as the prospect of future travels were too uncertain, we had to cancel at the beginning of this academic year all excursions. Yet, excursions at home is our response. The COVID-19 pandemic may force us to stay home and force us into house arrest, but we won't let it curb our perspective on the world at large. We willfully embrace the contradictio in terminis that makes up the title of this lecture series and invite you to travel from whichever room you are currently listening into this lecture to travel together. Not unlike the 18th century writer Xavier Demaitre, but supported by the newest technologies of global communication, we will travel together, yet each from our own room, to buildings, squares, and sites that our invited speakers cherish and wish to share with us. Be so good as to accompany me on my journey, Demetre summons us. He inspires us to embark on adventurous journeys right from our room. Let's turn the shared predicament of house arrest into a virtue. We will travel in short marches, laughing all along, laughing along the way at the travelers who have seen Rome and Paris. No obstacle will be able to stop us, and yielding merrily to our imagination, we will follow it wherever it wishes to lead us. End of quote. Excursions at home may be a compromise, but a good one, we hope. Consider a compromise to counter a situation that currently we are all sentenced to. And the first person to take us on a trip tonight is Maarten Delbeke, a veteran, so to speak, of the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning of Ghent University. Since 2016, Maarten holds the chair of the History and Theory of Architecture at the Department of Architecture at the ETH in Zurich, Switzerland. But he studied architecture at the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture in Ghent, at Ghent University, where he obtained his PhD in 2001. And after having been awarded the Scott Opler Fellowship in Architectural History in Oxford, he became a postdoctoral fellow with FVO, the Flemish Fund for Scientific Research. In 2005, he started teaching at the Universities of Ghent and Leiden. And he joined ETH Zurich in 2016, but prior to that, in 2014, he became full professor in the field of architectural history and theory at our own university in Ghent. It's fair to say that Maarten, during his time as an assistant and later as professor, was a founding force for what the program currently stands for. So it's a great pleasure for me and for all my colleagues that are listening in tonight to welcome him back, so to speak, if only for tonight, among our ranks. Maarten Delbeke has published widely on the history and theory of Baroque architecture and art in Rome, France, and the southern Netherlands, and about theoretical questions in 18th and 19th century European architecture. and the reception of early modern architecture in the 20th century. And he's also active as an architecture critic. A first collection of his critical essays was collected in 1997, entitled Aangenaam Verblijf, published by Vlees en Beton and presented during a memorable boat ride on the Leie in Kortrijk. I fondly remember that afternoon. Later, he also authored The Art of Religion, Sforza Pallavicino and Art Theory in Bernini's Rome, and too many scholarly articles to cite here. Tonight, Maarten Delbeke is taking us on a virtual road trip through Bayern. Tonight's excursion, he tells us, is an attempt to understand the diffusion and meaning of rococo in the region's religious architecture. May I ask everyone who's listening in to switch off the microphones, please? Maarten will take us to a few highlights, but also look at lesser known examples, maybe even crossing the border from Germany into Switzerland. This road trip, Maarten has promised, will be an exploration, a first acquaintance with a both fascinating and uncanny phenomenon. The lecture is in English for recording purposes, so we might put it also on our website, and to be kind to our international guests who are listening in. There will be room for questions after the talk, but I kindly invite you to put your questions in the chat. I will collect them and then address them to Maarten, or maybe ask the person who has formulated the question to formulate it herself or himself to Maarten. Voila, so it's now my honor and pleasure to give the word to Maarten. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the talk. Please, Maarten, virtual applause is already yours.
Thank you very much, Wouter, for this very kind introduction, and obviously also for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back, even if it's purely virtual, and to share with you the object of a quite recent fascination. What I will be talking about, or what I will be showing you, are literally mostly photos of an actual excursion to Bayern, and then, as promised, also to the Zurichsee. Bayern, as you all know, has a very well-established practice of building high-performance machines that lend themselves exquisitely to pimping. So the machine being upgraded with all kinds of gadgets to make it look even more powerful, and so on. And while I'm not going to take you to the BMW world in Munich, there's a lot to say about that building as well. I want to look in a way at the rococo architecture of Bayern and the Zurichsee as these kinds of pimped up machines for performance. The trip that I'm referring to is a trip that I took not this summer for obvious reasons, but the summer before. Those of you with whom I've traveled as part of the second year program will recognize this kind of maps, which in a still incomplete way indicate the possible highlights for an exploration of the rococo of Bayern. And what I will do is I will take you to first building, which is actually one of the most famous buildings there in Ottoburg, the Abbey Church of Ottoburgen. Lead you around and share some of the observations that I made there, and which obviously then became enhanced by further reading, and then explore by means of some other examples you could say the width and the implications of these observations. Then dive into perhaps more detailed analysis, also fed obviously by more scholarly literature, of another famous building, the Wyss, I mean, if time permits. And then, as I already said, take you to the Zurichsee, Zurichsee, where these kind of high performance, pimped high performance machines are not necessarily built, but in any case, grace its roads very abundantly. So this is our first case, Ottoburgen. It was also the first building that I thoroughly visited on the trip in question. Here you see an aerial view of the monastery, and then with the abbey church that is attached to it. Also, just to let you know, the lecture or the excursion will be very light on names and dates. I mean, if you want more, you can always ask. You can also always Google. So the intention is really to first start looking and then dig a little bit deeper. So we will focus on the church. And this is the interior. On the left, you see the interior of the church, looking from the entrance towards the choir or the main altar, and then on the right, you see the interior looking back from the crossing towards the entrance. And a text that I think very well describes the kind of first impression that you get when you enter the church was written by Anthony Blunt, the famous English architectural historian, art historian, and spy, who wrote a kind of report of a trip to Bayern, which he made when he was actually still in secondary school, still in grammar school. And I read out what you see marked on the left page. The first impressions which a visitor of Ottoburgen, of the Church of Ottoburgen, receives are of immense size and of a variety of ornament and unexpected color. Gradually, however, the different parts sort themselves out. Color and ornament become more coherent, and the size not overpowering but impressive. And then he emphasizes how actually the interior presents itself as an extremely well composed and actually clearly legible architectural whole. And I think it's interesting that Blunt, in order to describe this this transformation of first impression of chaos and of overwhelming chaos into a more ordered and structured whole, by referring to the color scheme of the interior, where, as you also see on this slide, and this is one of my holiday pics, you clearly see that there's actually a very structured relationship between white surfaces and white architectural elements and colored elements, but also that there's a kind of coherent color scheme that governs the whole interior and all its aspects, and a color scheme that basically goes from brown over gold to yellow, orange, pink, with hues of gray and blue, and that this color scheme in a way stands in the service of the architectural structure. It helps us to visually define its parts. It also allows us to establish relationships between these parts, between the walls and the columns, but also between the lower section, the cornice, and then everything that comes above it. And what I want to do now next is sort of, after we've sort of had this first impression, which is again the first impression of any visitor of the church, to look a little bit closer. Obviously, one of the defining elements of the whole interior are the large ceiling paintings, which grace the sequence of domes that cover the church interior. So the church is actually covered with 4 separate domes. And as you see here, so we have in a way the kind of ceiling paintings with which we are familiar from the Italian tradition, where the dome basically opens up to the heavens, or where there's a kind of illusionistic architecture that establishes a kind of scene that is in a way self-contained, but at the same time also literally rooted in the architecture of the church itself. But it's also so in that sense, you look at something that is actually quite conventional and quite well known. There's a dome, and out of the four supports of the dome, we have elements that then basically support a frame for this illusionistic painting. But if you look closer at some other paintings, we see that actually this relationship between, we immediately see how complicated actually the relationship between painting, frame, and architecture becomes. And this is the painting showing Jesus chasing the merchants from the temple, a biblical scene which actually is surprisingly often depicted at the entrance of these rococo churches. Probably, I mean, and that's a pure guess as a way of dissociating the opulence and the richness of the interior from any mercantile or association. But if we look at the frame of this painting, we see a couple of interesting things. First of all, the shape itself, which is a kind of sequence of concave and convex forms. But also, especially if you look at the fields of the painting and the way in which these concave and convex elements react to the ribs of the architecture, it almost feels as if it's a painting that has been glued over a cross vault. So the field of the painting basically follows the accidental shape of the architecture. And a third element that I think is worth attention is obviously, you could say, the composition of the frame. First of all, it's not a closed frame. The frame is open. The elements in the golden elements don't touch, but they leave an opening, and this opening is invaded literally by this rocaille, which then grows out further into the field of the architecture. And so when I talk about the rocailles, I'm talking about these gray elements. Rocailles are these elements which are composed of shell-like or rock-like matter, which often assume the shape of curves, either curves in the shape of an C or of an S. And so, in a way, what you see here is that the rocaille elements contribute to framing the painting. At the same time, they challenge the frame. They sort of break it up. And thirdly, they almost serve as a way of sort of connecting the materiality of the painting and the frame to the materiality of the architecture. And if we look further, I mean, now with a special eye to the rocaille in the interior, and we see how the rocaille basically pops up between the various elements of decoration in the vault. So the rocaille almost becomes a kind of actor, a living and living actor between the various other kinds of forms and figures, mainly the human figures, but also the natural components that we see in the stucco and in the painting. In that sense, it also clearly plays a role in allowing for transitions between flat elements in reliefs, between painting, sculpture, and architecture. And thirdly, it's important to note how I need to move something here. The rocaille operates on various scales, literally as something that almost eats into these capitals, into the capitals of the columns, and then works as a kind of acrotegon. Here becomes a support for a frame, small scale, but then grows into a cartouche, a framing device for an image, up to becoming a kind of frame in its own right that sort of occupies the architecture. Now, I mean, it's very hard to avoid the virus metaphor when you talk about, I mean, when you start looking at the rocaille more closely. It's also interesting that in this case in Ottoburen, that there are clear limits also to the way it proliferates across the architecture, and a very important element and a very important limiting element is, as you can see here, the cornice. The cornice, which literally works as a kind of white band across the interior. And there, I think it's actually striking that the cornice is composed, and this is also something that you see in many of these mid-18th century Rococo churches, purely of horizontal elements. So there's no vertical interruption, there are no dentils, no egg and dart motifs, there are no consoles, and so on. So it's really a kind of horizontal line that goes across the interior, separating what is above and below, sometimes sort of being barely touched by these rocailles that grow up to it, and then obviously only articulated when the cornice intersects with the columns, and so in that way also reinforcing the architectural articulation of the space. If we then look at the zone underneath the column, so this is actually a look in the transept. So here you see the pulpit. This is one of the altars in the transept, and this is then further away in depth. I think the slide shows quite well the coherence of the color scheme. You see that these rocailles become much less prominent. And in a way, perhaps more functional, or more, you could say, subordinated to the architectural elements. But they're still there as a kind of flourishes, almost as elements that grow out of the architecture and serve as here as a support for a putu, or almost like flares or flames or embers that dance up towards the higher region of the church. And in so doing, I think, I mean, this is kind of side observation. I think it's interesting to see how these kind of upward movements also inspire or suggest an analogy between the architecture here and the architecture that is painted on the ceiling. But again, the rocailles also appear when we zoom inwards, when we zoom downwards. Here we see that how rocailles basically attach themselves to the frames of the cyboria and the casings that are used to frame, in this case, a small miracle working image of the Virgin Mary, here sets of relics, and even go in a way the rocailles even crawl into these cases where they serve literally to attach the relics to their carrier, or where they adorn the skeletons of martyrs that are on display, and we will look at those skeletons a little bit more in detail in a moment, because they are too cool not to. At the same time, and again, what I'm trying to evoke here are literally the kind of observations that I made while I spent an hour in the interior of the church. If you start looking more closely, you also see other elements, or elements which are clearly of a different nature. And this epitaph is actually part of a series of elements that is placed against the external wall. I think there are 4 in total on each side, which speak in a way a different visual language. If you want, you see that the overall impression is one of symmetry. The color scheme is different. It's a set of grays, blacks, and golds. And there is and gildings. There are still rocailles, but they are in a way made subservient to a literally to a larger frame. So you could say the challenge of the frame that we saw in the scene of Christ chasing the merchants from the temple no longer applies. If we then zoom in on what is being written here, it becomes in a way even more interesting because I'm paraphrasing what stands here. It says that in this box we put all the relics of all the people who were buried here and for which we could not find another place. That's what's literally being said. After they had been disturbed during the riots of 1525. And where the rusticorum, where the farmers and the heretics basically made a mess of the whole situation. And so it's in 1772 that we rebury them after the events of 1723. So this is clearly part of a late decoration campaign, but it commemorates a moment that actually predates the Baroque and Rococo reconstruction of Ottoburgen, and in a way sort of establishes a kind of monument for this historical event. So, let's see what comes from these first observations. I would like sort of, one of the things that occurred to me is, and perhaps it's actually useful to make very explicit that the goal or the ambition of the trip was literally for me to come to terms with Rococo architecture, because I didn't know it very well, but also I wasn't very familiar with it, but I also didn't see any entry point into it. I've worked a lot on Baroque architecture, Baroque decoration, and Rococo seemed to be this kind of degenerate cousin, where actually the whole rhetorical and very precise apparatus of Baroque suddenly becomes this playful explosion of sweet rather than powerful ornament. So, I mean, this is a very old prejudice which I carried with me into Bayern, but with the strong intention to improve my ways. And actually, by looking at Ottoburgen, I started to realize that it's actually possible to look at these artifacts, these literally pimped machines, as layered artifacts. In a way, I think by now it should be self-evident that the rocaille is a kind of layer that sort of grafts itself on various surfaces, enters into kind of playful relationship with them, but also challenges basically whatever comes in its way. So it seems to be kind of organic growing matter that develops across surface, scale, and across medium, almost a kind of primordial crust. A second, you could say, form of layering that I discovered, and that's also why I showed this last example, is a kind of process of historical layering. In a way, you could say the visual coherence of these Rococo interiors suggests also a unity of moment. So it suggests that there is a kind of continuity and coherence in the historical process that has given way to them. But if you start looking more closely, you see that actually the building campaigns and the decoration campaigns of many of these churches lasted from 50 years up to close to a century. And then as a kind of consequence of that, there's also literally kind of stacking of different different artistic campaigns and different artistic inventions that happens in these interiors. Something again that is in a way belied by the overwhelming nature of the first impression, but which becomes apparent when you start peeling things away. At the same time, it's also clear that there's also almost a kind of celebration of this historical layering that happens in these buildings, because many things, and I could use many more examples, and we can talk about that more extensively, basically are elements, iconographies, histories that basically point back to an earlier moment in time, and which becomes incorporated in this thing. So there's, you could say, the layering of the rocaille, which almost acts like a kind of crust. Second, kind of historical layering. Yeah? And then thirdly, almost as a kind of logical consequence of this historical layering, also a layering of intentions. Again, these interiors present themselves as unity with a clear focus, clear direction, clear hierarchy. But when you start looking more closely, you see actually that they are polycentric, and that there are actually various objects and various elements that compete for attention, and that these various objects and various elements probably can be related to different kinds of actors, different kinds of agencies that somehow are invested in the fabric of the church. Now, to develop this a little bit further, I want to show a couple of examples, all from the same trip. Actually, the next day, we visited Wettenhausen, which is an Augustinian, a very old Augustinian establishment, also in Bayern. And and here I give a little bit of historical background, which was actually unknown to me when I was there. The church consists of a choir, which was built in the early 16th century, around 1520. Yeah? Then there's a tower, which is from the early 17th century, and then the nave, in a way, not in a way, the nave was added in the late 17th century by Peter Tump, one of the main architects of the period. But again, here the overall impression, the first impression that one encounters when you see the interior, belies this historical process. Again, there's a tendency to unify the space by this very deliberate use of white stucco that decorates the whole interior, which is here used. So it's typically late 17th century decorative scheme, in the sense that on the one hand, the architecture itself, the architectural elements themselves are much more ornate than what we see in Ottoburgen. But at the same time, each of the elements keeps to itself, keeps to its own, you could say, to its own playing ground. And this white architecture is then contrasted on the one hand with this coherent set of altars, which are all black and gold, and then a very limited number of paintings. And I just want to point out actually something that I find incredibly interesting is the position of the altars. So you have the main altar here, which was its traditional place, and then there are two altars here which frame the main altar. But then here in these small transepts, rather than putting the altar here facing outward, they are again at the short side to act. You can see it a little bit here, act as additional framing devices for what is here. for the main altar. And it's actually when you start looking at the altar that is here behind this flag or behind this drapery, that again you see that these elements of this kind of unified decorative scheme are again very conscious, very sophisticated composites of reused older elements. And so this is actually, you can see it quite well here. So a late Gothic wooden sculpted altarpiece, which has probably been re-gilded in a way to make it more coherent with its new architectural frame. And it even looks as if these various paintings here in the predella, here the painting of the predella, have been recuperated from earlier versions. So this is literally a montage of earlier elements into the new architectural language of the late 17th century transformation. And this becomes even more explicit if you look at the elements that you see against the side walls, where you see a series of uniform edicula. So they are all quite similar, a kind of pilaster. Very conventional, I mean, not very conventional, but quite conventional edicula with a broken pediment, but which then serve as frames of visibly older objects. And what I think is really interesting is that this is also thematized. So they are literally shown as mounted objects. In this case, thanks to the addition of this very heavy and very voluptuous frame. And even within then the object here, you see a marvelous periphery, Man of Sorrows. Here you see in the inscription, you can see that this work was made in the 32nd year of the reign of Charles V, which, and I had to look it up, is amounts to 1551. But here the name of Charles V has been changed, which, because it's done so visibly, is literally mise en scène of the historical layeredness of the object. And then next to one of these edicula, you find this this confessional, which is actually then mirrored in this door on the other side, which again shows rocaille in all its flamboyant appearances, and which is clearly a later addition again to these campaigns, but which sort of in a way arranges itself or positions itself clearly within the order that was established by the late 17th century transformation. And here this is an example, but what I'm saying now is pure speculation, where it almost seems as if this piece is being treated as a pseudo antique. So it receives the same treatment as the 15th and 16th century stones that were framed here. But it's probably later, especially if you look at the decoration, that actually might well date from the moment when the whole church was being rebuilt. But it's framed as if it was older, basically sort of to give it the aura of antiquity. Again, what I'm saying here is pure speculation, but there's clearly kind of stylistic but also material discrepancy between what you see here and what you see there, which allows me to venture this kind of hypothesis. So, so in a way, you could say that this framing device is very deliberately used to stage historicity and to stage this kind of layeredness. I mean, and just to be clear, I was very struck to see this. There's a very famous example in San Giovanni and St. John in the Lateran, where Borromini also treated the old altars basically as almost as pièces trouvées, as objects that were put on display in the new altars that he designed. And this is another example of that, but now in provincial Bayern. And then a second example, again, of this process of layering and in a way also pimping, is something that I literally discovered in the Abbey Church of Waldsassen. This is a church of a Benedictine monastery, which is actually one of the few Benedictine monasteries of the 18th century, which still or again works as a monastery. On the right, on the left, you see the exterior. On the right, you see the interior, which where you have a kind of stucco decoration, which is quite similar to our previous example. But the most striking element in Waldsassen is the presence of these dressed up skeletons, which are mounted in glass boxes. And Waldsassen is exceptional in the number of skeletons that that you find there. On each altar, there's at least one. On some of the larger altars, there are two or even three. Yeah? Which literally gives the impression, and it's incredibly impressive. So if you ever go there, Waldsassen is quite close to the Czech border. So if you're on your way to Prague or whatever, you can stop there. It really gives the impression of a kind of guard, an oratic guard that establishes a kind of almost protective circle within the confines of the church. And so here you see the altar of which they are part. This whole practice of putting dressed up skeletons in display cases is something that you find actually across Central Europe, also in the Catholic regions of Switzerland, and it started basically in the early 17th century, and it was actually the Swiss Guard that plays an important role in the transfer of these skeletons from the catacombs of Rome to Bayern, and then to Switzerland, and then to Bayern. And actually, the earliest example in Bayern is in Ochsenhausen, where we can still see in this side altar where you see the box, and I wanted to show this one because here you also see that these boxes were most often covered with a painting, a panel with a painting relating to the life of the martyr who was. Most often also the death of the martyr who was hidden in it. And Ochsenhausen is also a very interesting example of a church, of actually a Gothic church that was baroquisiert, turned into a Baroque church. I just wanted to show this element where you clearly see the pointed arch window, which has been translated into what one could call a rococo window. Obviously, the desire to move these skeletons to Bayern was rooted in the cult of the martyrs, the early Christians who were murdered by the Romans for their faith and who were buried in the catacombs. And as such, they were venerated as soldiers of religion, but also in a way as imitators of Christ, in the sense that they gave their life and their blood for their faith. And here, I mean, I just wanted to show you here because this was spotted by an eagle-eyed alumnus of the department in Ghent, Jasper van Parijs, who noted that. So this, just to be explicit, this is a very important publication, a 17th century publication on the catacombs and the martyrs who were buried there. And it's a book that tries, for the first time, tries to give a kind of overview of the catacombs and everything that they contain. And it's actually an illustration of this book that clearly served as an inspiration for an element, and that is part of the setup here in Waldsassen, a small vase which was thought to contain the blood of the martyr. Now, so we are looking literally at imported objects, and that's basically what I want to emphasize. So these skeletons have value because they are not from Bayern, they are not from the local soil. So they're literally drawn from the soil of Rome, of you could say the mother city of the Catholic Church, and in a way called to Bayern to help to defend the faith. I think it's also important to realize that when these skeletons arrived, they arrived as boxes. So in boxes, so they almost arrived as kind of building sets of a kind of miniature car or something, and they had to be put together, and more often than not, significant parts of the body had to be fabricated. And this was a work that was delegated mostly to nuns, but actually in the case of Waldsassen, it was the Augustinians themselves who made this kind of incredibly intricate, incredibly rich, richly decorated clothing that in a way suggested the body of the skeleton, but also transformed it again into a soldier of the faith. So in a way, you could say the first construction in which these skeletons were housed was their clothing, and then they were put in a box, in a box where they were shown as the Roman soldier they must have been, and these boxes were then mounted on the altars. But so what I found, especially, so first of all, I was obviously struck by the multitude and the quantity of these skeletons, and again the way in which they were part of this kind of theatrical mise en scène. But then when I started looking more closely at their, you could say, almost architectural relationship of these boxes to the altars, it suddenly became very clear to me that these boxes were added later. So actually quite long, probably sometime after the completion of the altar itself. And it has to do with the very banal observation that these boxes cover the lower part of a probably pretty expensive painting. And then if you start looking more closely, then you see that actually a lot of the gilded ornamental elements that are part of the boxes and in a way expand or frame the boxes was probably also added later. So, and here you see this kind of flame-like rocaille element, which again contains some relics, and this was probably not part of the original arrangement of the altar. And this seems to be confirmed by never closer examination. So it seems literally as if these rocailles, these gilded elements, have been bolted onto the altar at the moment when these boxes were added. So and I think here we are literally talking about a process of pimping. So this is another example of a box that's basically almost literally squeezed in between the columns of the altar, almost in a way sort of to increase its effectiveness. So again, here we are completely in a kind of BMW logic. You have an altar. What is an altar? An altar is a machine for salvation. You pray for the good of your soul. And in order to make it more effective, you bolt on an extra piece of bling to make sure that its effectiveness is only increased. But it also shows something about, again, the materiality of these altars. So they are made of wood, they're painted wood. Sometimes they are made of stucco marble. We'll be looking at that. So, which again tells us something about their scenographic ambitions. Good. I'll have a look at the time. Wouter, how much do I have?
Maarten, I think we're all mesmerized by what you're showing, so please continue.
Okay, so then thank you. So then I will show the final German example before, as a kind of coda, I move to, it's a two-tailed coda, move to Switzerland. So also literally the last church that I saw on that trip is the Wies. Again, the Wies is not really an obscure piece of architecture. It's listed as a UNESCO World Heritage. It's also one of the few churches that I saw on that trip, which is also a really popular tourist destination. And I want to walk you very briefly through the Wies and to be completely transparent about what I'm doing. What I'll be presenting here is obviously a short reading of the Wies, which is not founded in first-hand observation, but in the literature on the church, which is obviously abundant because it's such an incredible work of architecture. But the reading that I want to develop is again by looking at by thinking about the relationship between the building and you could say the kind of particular, in a way, foreign object that sits at its center, and the role that Hokai in a way plays to, you could say, mediate or articulate the presence of that object in the architecture. So you could say the official name of the Church of the Wies, just means meadow. It's a church built in a meadow. It's the Church of the Flagellated Christ. And it is a church built in honor or to facilitate pilgrimage to this small image showing the flagellated Christ, which is a small statue of which we know that it was made in the 1730s as a prop for processions. It was discarded. It was taken by a pious woman into her farm. She discovered that this statue cried occasionally. Then a modest chapel was built for the statue, which immediately attracted pilgrims. The chapel was consecrated in 1744, as you can see. I mean, you can read it for yourself, and almost immediately there is the desire to build a larger church to accommodate the increasing number of pilgrims. The statue is then carried into the new choir, and then the church is completed and consecrated by the bishop. The reason why I give this very short history is that I just want to suggest that actually the statue is the driver of the development of the church. So if you look at the history of the church, you see that the church authorities basically run after the developments. I mean, the first chapel is standing for 4 years before it becomes consecrated. So it's literally something that is driven by popular devotion with all the kind of political and religious struggles that brings with it. But we're not going to focus on that. And again, so the you could say the agency of the statue is also discussed, for instance, in this text, which is the sermon that was preached when the church was dedicated, which basically has the preacher saying, "Oh my God!" And so there's a lot of OMG going on. Why did you choose this statue and this place? And then in a typical Catholic circular argument, they say, well, you chose this. It's clear that you chose this place because all the graces that you bestow on it work. People have miracles, so these miracles prove that you were right to choose this place. So, in a way, the effectiveness of the image proves the reason why it was chosen in the first place. So, but again, just to show how central the role of the image is in the history of the church. Here you see an engraving, an image of the first chapel. I think it's interesting to note already that you have a kind of apse, and here is a door and two windows. So people were probably passing through this door, through another door, when they went to visit the statue. And when it was then decided sort of to transform this wooden statue in a stone building, it is very probably, and it's actually the first element that was being built was actually the choir. So this is first project of the church as it was more or less built. But the first element that was built was the choir. And it was when the choir was finished that the image, you can see that here, was brought in procession from the old chapel to the new church. And it actually, from the sources, it seems plausible that the choir was almost conceived as an independent unit, which could have stood on its own. This montage shows the Wieskig with only its choir. So this hypothesis has been tested in a way by simulating it, which is probably a matter of two concerns. One, of prudence. There are many miracle working statues in the history of Europe that suddenly stopped performing miracles, which then also obviously meant the end of pilgrimage and of the income. So there was a kind of a prudence involved. But again, it really shows that the choir is again the heart. The choir that was built around the statue is the heart of the whole sanctuary. And this is what it looks like. I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time. First thing, it's one of the most astounding pieces of architecture that I know of. And I just want to point out a couple of key features. So the small statue is framed in this ciborium, which clearly serves, you could say, to amplify and to emphasize the presence of the statue in the space. But at the same time, the statue is in a way balanced with a second focal point, which is this painting of the Holy Family. And this element is framed in columns which form part of a kind of baldachin that stands over this ciborium, and which form part of this screen that runs around the space. Whereas this painting sits here and forms part of the wall that forms a kind of shell around this skeletal structure that sits in it. Now, what does this do? I mean, it does a lot of things. One thing, of course, is that it draws attention to the statue. The whole choir almost works as a kind of amplifier of the small statue. But at the same time, and this is, I think, the incredibly interesting ambiguity of the whole thing. At the same time, it also distances the viewer and the beholder from the same statue, not just by putting it in this single case, but also by adding this second focus, which actually requires more distance to be seen and to be understood. And in a way, since both focal points are part of the same architectural composition draws attention away from this single point. And this kind of play of, in a way, framing and distancing is something that also is at play in the iconography, and in the way that the space is being used. The whole iconography, so the images in the space are all moments in the life of Christ. You go from the Holy Family to the glory of the cross and the ceiling. So it's in a way, and this statue is the middle point between what is being shown here and what is being shown there, and one could sort of develop this iconographical reading further. I mean, here just I'm going to move a little bit forward, and then I'll come back. But at the same time, it also, you could say, separates a kind of sphere where the official, the biblical, and the institutionalized history of Christ, and the history of the gospel, is in a way played out or distant from the anecdotal history of this particular image, and the image of the pious farmer's wife who found the statue in a meadow, saw it crying, and then started to worship from it. And these images of this kind of much more intimate and this much more popular devotion are literally relegated to the zone here, to the zone between the screen of columns and the wall, which was probably, I mean, if I understand it correctly, and I actually might be completely wrong, was also the way in which people approached the image. So they would come into the church, would go here, and then would pass in front of the church. For instance, here also in this ex voto, in this Thanksgiving image, this woman is shown in much closer proximity to the statue than she could ever get. So again, what I try to say is that in a way, there's a kind of valorizing of the image, amplification of its presence, but obviously this whole apparatus also distances whoever wants to come close to the image, distances it from the kind of popular devotional practices of which it was probably part, and literally reframes it into the sanctioned history of gospel rather than in the anecdotal history of its discovery. And I think an important element of sort of building this apparatus is the rocaille, the rocaille, which here becomes now a completely fully architectural element. And this is not a very original observation, but it's also something that you can't miss when you see it. So the rocailles, which which I discussed as a kind of crust sitting on the architecture, in a way now literally sink into the architecture and start to make it also almost malleable and start to transform it. And in that sense, I think it's one of the closest architectural equivalents that you can get to the kind of printed, to this kind of prints that you see here from de la Joux and Messonnier, who show an architecture that is entirely and completely composed of rocaille-like elements, but which obviously perform this exercise in the realm of print. I mean, I will leave the whiz there. And now, so as the coda, I want to go to the Zurichsee, so the Lake Zurich, close to the ETH, where we visited Wiedenswil on actually the last trip that we could do right before the second lockdown, so in the third week of October, At the ETH, we have a program where we have a week of travel each term, always the third week of October, the third week of March. Obviously, the trip in last March, which was going to take us to vernacular Greek architecture of the Ottoman period, had to be cancelled, but will definitely take place. And we were confined to Switzerland for this October, and we literally could make the trip right before, in a way, the axe fell. So I'm incredibly happy that we've been able to do that. So our trip was devoted to Swiss rococo, which, and again, I'm going to be very clear about it, I thought was a contradiction in terms, but it isn't. There's an enormous amount of rococo in Switzerland, and not just in the Catholic parts, but also in the Reformed parts, in the Protestant parts. And this is what I want to show and discuss here, because obviously in the examples that I've been showing, the whole use of rocaille and this whole rococo repertoire was, as I've tried to show, intimately tied up with the very Catholic ideas that these churches were meant to sustain and express. But we also see the emergence of rocaille in the context of Reformed churches. This church in Wiedenswil was built in the 1760s, so a little bit after the Wies, by Johann Ulrich Grubenmann, who was a carpenter, actually a bridge builder, and decorated by one of the most important stucco artists in Switzerland, Peter Anton Moosbrugger. And this is the exterior of the church, where you see a very simple volume, which from the exterior is only articulated by a very limited number of sandstone elements, these pilasters, and then these two very simple cornices. But it's almost like, again, it's kind of a thing that suddenly pops up where you don't expect it. Here you have these kind of rocaille elements and that sit, literally nestle themselves between the pilasters and the roof. And this is the interior. So this is an iPhone panorama picture of the interior. It's but in a way, it shows one of the. It shows two of the main features of the church. It's a so-called Querkirche, a transept church, which means that the center of attention, which obviously in a Protestant church is the pulpit, is installed in the center of the longest side, and not on the short side. And secondly, the picture also shows something of the incredible span of the church. Well, it's 21 by 36 meters. The roof itself is 12-meter high, and it is actually it was already at the time of its construction considered as a spectacular feat of engineering / carpentry. And it is basically a wooden bridge that rests on the wall and from which the ceiling hangs. Which means another element that I want to point out is that it has this kind of monumental empore or gallery. The organ is a later addition, but which means that the church could house 1,500, could seat 1,500 people. Now, just going back to the roof, I just want to. I mean, so again, you could say the spectacular construction of the roof means that tectonics, in a way, building, making this thing is a theme. And so there is, and that's what I want to show, a very deliberate play, and here rocaille ornament is used in a very deliberate way to evoke the issue of tectonics in this church. Which, and that's, you could say, the more fundamental point I make, in a way shows something and about how rocaille can function in a context where it is no longer a frame for an image, because obviously, because it's a Protestant church, there are no images, so there's no ceiling painting and so on. So you could say that the whole decorative apparatus is the rocaille itself, and in a way it declares itself as such by playing very deliberately on the tectonics. I mean, the fact that tectonics is a play is very clearly indicated with this element, which is actually quite astounding. So it's a hanging capital, which was there and which is clearly a way of saying that, look at this, I don't need a column. So, and you can add whichever expression you like to that. So it's really saying, okay, I mean, to put it in a polite way, look without hands. But already here you see also that the support for this beam doesn't touch the ground, but is clearly anchored into the wall. And I think it's also interesting to look at this pilaster, which corresponds with the sandstone pilaster on the outside, which lands and almost sort of falls over the wood of the benches. And so it is clear that this pilaster never ever touched the ground. So it was never presented as a kind of tectonic element. Here you see that again. And here we see, you get an idea of you could say, the overall decorative scheme. You have these pilasters, which again don't touch the ground and barely seem to touch the vault, but which also in their decoration sort of flourish into this kind of rocaille element, but which stop there. So they halt there. And something different happens with the ribs. So there are these kind of stems that grow on the ribs. And it's in a way out of these stems that the whole decorative scheme and the whole pattern that covers the ceiling grows. So there's a clear dissociation of these pilasters as tectonic elements, which are already in a way weakened because they are isolated. And they're really treated as singular loose elements from the whole decorative scheme, which actually literally grows out of the ribs that you see here. So in a way, it is literally a kind of organicism that is being celebrated here, where the lines rather than the mass of the architecture, or you could say the load-bearing elements, produce the decorative scheme and the ornaments. And this then culminates in this incredible element in the middle, which is a kind of non-figurative or pseudo-figurative element, which obviously somewhere evokes a cross, but which is obviously also kind of composite of all kinds of rocaille forms. All this in a way to make sure that the true focus of the space is this the pulpit. The pulpit, which is made in fake marble. And again, look at this, the fake marble, which is actually a kind of stucco with marble powder that is being applied on a wooden structure that almost seems sort of to sink over the wood, over the benches, but where there's no indication of any structure or any tectonic element at all. It's pure plasticity, which then it receives this incredible crown of rocailles as a kind of white outgrowth on this black element. My final two slides. So this as a way of sort of opening a kind of reflection or of how a kind of architectural decorative set of instruments in a way sort of translates from a Catholic to non-Catholic context, and how it in a way literally behaves differently, but always in a way as a kind of parasitic or supplementary structure that challenges and plays with what is there. And a second, and this is the literally really the final example of this kind of translation, is a series of cupboards that we saw, Bauernmöbel, so farmers' furniture, from a private collection of Bruno Bischofberger, from both Austria and Switzerland. So these are examples from Austria, where you see the rocaille elements here, but also you could say the techniques of fake marble that are being used on wood, and these kind of crowning elements that actually evoke what we saw. And here again, these are some Swiss examples from Appenzell. And this is a kind of ongoing conversation that we have at the chair, also with my team, about how one should read these artifacts. So in a way, they are clearly derivative. These it's known that these were made by local craftsmen who basically produced only for people in their village and their close vicinity. It's clear that they were aware, probably through prints, but probably also through religious architecture of certain motifs and certain schemes. But they are then, in a way, very successfully and very deliberately transformed, not in a different medium, so in pure paint, but also in a different field of application, where there's a kind of shift of repertory from the interior of the public building to the private interior, but where there's clearly kind of reminiscence of the kind of ambition towards visual complexity, but also to the evocation of certain higher meanings, of higher ideas that remains sitting there. What is also very interesting is that it's not just a transfer from high art to popular art, from, you could say, precious material. I mean, even if there, as I've tried to show, we should be careful as well to less precious materials, but it's also a geographical and a chronological shift. And these kinds of this kind of furniture was made until deep into the late 18th, early 19th century. And so this again raises the question of how kind of forms of formal repertories persist in particular contexts and why they persist there. Okay, I am through. I will unshare my screen. I hope you enjoy it, and I'm eager to hear comments or questions.
Thank you, Maarten, profoundly for a very exciting trip with, amazingly interesting and quirky pieces of architecture to furniture. So I think this was a really astounding trip. As I said to the virtual audience, we have now time for questions. And I'd like to ask you to put those questions in the chat, which I then will redirect to Maarten, if there are any. I can assume that you might have to digest a bit what we've just seen, but nevertheless, I'm sure there must be questions. And just to kickstart the process, Maarten, I have a question of my own. I know for sure from our past together that you have a proclivity for pimped cars, but nevertheless, your interest in rococo. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you said somewhere in the middle of your talk, that it is, I sort of understood it as a kind of revisionist exercise of recalibrating the understanding of rococo as what you called it, degenerative cousin or degenerate cousin. So is it driven by your own, obviously, interest in these spectacularly interesting buildings, but also to revise your own views on it. It's like a revision of what you thought in the past, or like what has brought you to the subject, maybe.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's obviously very banal. I mean, it's not that banal. The reason is now that it's much closer to me geographically, and it's literally a way of engaging with the architecture in a way that surrounds me. But there's a more fundamental reason. So I've been working, I mean, quite a lot on French classicism, and you could say the development of classicism in the 18th century. I mean, if there are still people who had the second year course, they know about my obsession for Perrault and Loger. And in a way, and I think I'm not alone there. In a way, history, architectural history, moves from the Baroque and then to more classicizing phase in the 18th century, and then you get historicism and so on. And Rococo was for me this kind of noise in the background. As you said, this kind of degenerate and slightly retarded art form. I really started to understand that I was completely wrong for two reasons. Because on the one hand, I think you can only understand what happens in classicism in the 18th century as something that is really driven by kind of anxiety about something else, about an other. Which then is a rococo, and in a way, Loger is quite explicit about that. He complains about the colifichet in the architecture, so all these kind of tiny ornaments. He also literally talks about paper architecture, which is not real architecture. But again, if you obviously there's work of some other scholars on Blondel and on the younger Blondel, which have inspired me, which have made me understood that in a way you can also read classicism and neoclassicism as a way to reclaim for architecture certain things that were basically taken over by this thing, this other thing, and this virus that basically crawls over all manners of interiors. So that's one thing. And second thing, the second thing is that in a way, if you start looking around, I mean, to put it in perhaps too simple terms, there's more Rococo than classicism. I mean, there's an enormous amount of, and it's international. It's develops over a very long time until deep into the 19th century. It's also one of those styles where it's actually very difficult to distinguish between late and neo. What would be late Rococo and neo Rococo? So it was literally the kind of recognition of a blind spot in my understanding of what was going on in European architecture in the 18th century. And then obviously when you start looking at it, it's incredibly cool stuff. So you get sucked into it.
Yeah. No, that was clear that it's turned into a personal fascination, but there is obviously a reason behind it that has to do with the writing of history. So yeah,
exactly.
thanks.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
very much so.
Yeah. I have a question by Nele. Nele de Raad, who says hi to the rest of the department. And she has two questions. She compliments you with the lecture, and something that has always intrigued me in Rococo architecture is the contrast between interior and exterior. While interior surfaces are enriched with all kinds of ornamentation, decoration, the exterior surfaces are very plain. Any thoughts on this contrast? And maybe can I pose the second one as well?
Sure.
And there seems to be a contradiction in Rococo architecture. On the one hand, a wealth of ornamentation, on the other hand, executed in cheap materials.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, hypothesis? So the contrast between interior and exterior, and then between rich decoration and cheap materials.
Yeah. I mean, these are two very good and very big questions. I think for the first question, it does depend a little bit on context, but I think the answer would be different for uh, religious architecture than non-religious architecture, residential architecture. So in residential architecture, and we've sort of encountered also in Switzerland many instances where it's literally a question of appropriateness. So where you could say the display of ornament of richness is confined to the interior as a way of sort of contrasting it with exterior modesty. And I think in a way you can sort of extend that argument to religious architecture as well, where you could say the building as a whole serves as a kind of landmark, but where actually also it's also made clear to the visitor that the real work happens inside, and that this is where one should be and where you could say the things happen, so that it's not in the exterior. And perhaps, I mean, it's really interesting to see that actually the motive of the gate is very prominent in many decorative schemes, which really play for instance, in the Wies, you have a monumental gate that is painted in the ceiling. When you turn back to the outside, you see a monumental gate. It's the gate of the apocalypse. It's the gate towards the end of time. So this difference between interior and exterior is really thematized. So I think it's literally that. It's saying actually the interior is where it happens, not in the exterior. The the cheapness issue, I think that in a way I mean it's something that I'm still obviously, I mean, on all these things, this is all very fresh and young, but I think it's a matter of efficiency, of availability of building materials, and of um, kind of very well-established workplace practices, which allow people in a way to build actually quite fast, quite spectacular buildings. I mentioned the drawn-out building processes of of many of these churches, which were almost always a matter of financing. So I think there was you could say the technical and the material capacity to do these things very quickly, partly because the materials were cheap. They didn't have to bring marble from wherever. Actually, one of the really interesting things to look at in these churches are the floors. And there are almost never marble floors. They're always terracotta. And so it's really a matter of making sure that the things are built with locally available means.
Okay, Nele, shout out if you have another question, but I'd like to move to the second one by Dana D. She says, I'm most impressed by the last church in near Zurich, and the name escapes her as me as well at this moment.
Yeah, it's okay. Wiedenswil, the Reformed.
Wiedenswil, yeah, exactly. The abstracted form of rococo might be of a different period than the other churches we've seen. Is that true?
That's a very good remark. Actually, I mean, so again, it's partly again contextual. We are looking at a context where it's simply not allowed to have images. So there is a kind of reluctance also to include figurative elements in the Rococo. But it's a very good observation, because these Swiss examples, and this is actually quite early example, the Swiss examples continue until the 1790s, and they achieve amazing levels of abstraction and complexity, and which in a way I think is part of a kind of logical, if you want to call stylistic development. You could say that the whole repertory is well established by the 1750s and 1760s. Then you have these people who have to work in a context that calls for restraint, and so they work. You could say literally on the limits of the formal possibilities of the medium. But it's a very good observation. Yeah.
Okay, then the next question is by our shared friend Guy Chatel, who asks the question, would the hypothesis that rocaille is a solution for the accidents of building in time make any sense? Classicism as devoid of rocaille then being made possible by development of the building industry, hence much shorter realization campaigns.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very interesting remark, because obviously it is a way of sort of adding a layer which can actually, in a way, I mean, these things are incredibly complicated and difficult to do, but but quite easily give an impression of coherence in indeed very layered interiors. Actually, one of the churches we saw in Switzerland had three decoration campaigns over the space of 60 years, and where it was actually clear that this kind of very nasty mint-colored rocaille was literally used in a way to accommodate to. I mean, to give a kind of uniformity, but at the same time, and this there I think, and because this building in time is double. So on the one hand, it's you could say the desire for coherence, and the desire for unity, which translates a kind of unity of intention. I think Hokai lends itself to that. At the same time, it is by definition an almost open form, which, and in that sense, I think the comparison with neoclassicism is really interesting, which neoclassicism in a way isn't, because it relies entirely on composition, and this composition has to be coherent from the beginning until the end to work. But I think it's really interesting. Sort of, it's an interesting point.
Then there's a question by one of our master students, Thibaut de Smet, who asks or has a question on the place where the inside and the outside meet. Is there something special to say about the decorated windows in Rococo when compared to other styles?
That's a very good question. Yes. And I didn't include any examples of this in the talk. What you often see is a real, I mean, no coincidence that Venturi was also fascinated by Rococo, an ambiguity between the interior treatment and the exterior treatment of the windows. I showed a single window in Oxenhausen, where, in a way, in a very superficial way, this kind of Gothic window was transformed into something that looks more 18th century. But then obviously in the interior, they become part of the whole decorative apparatus, which very often dissolves this kind of reminiscence of the old window. And it also goes back to Neil's question. So exteriors are often painted rather than treated architecturally, so with relief or stucco. So in that sense, again, the windows are treated in an understated way, but also have literally different kind of architectural or compositional appearance than they do in the interior. So often it's actually quite difficult to match the interior to the exterior. So it's a very interesting point to look at. Yeah.
Okay. Questions keep rolling in, Maarten, so you're still up for a long evening,
Yeah,
long haul. And the next one is by Johan Laga, who asked the following question: to what extent is your reading of the position of Rococo in the 18th century debate on architecture building on extending or opposing Reichward's analysis of that period in his first book, The First Moderns, which Dirk de Meyer has suggested Johan to read a long time ago? So is current scholarship approaching Rococo from a rather radically different angle, as your work on Baroque, for instance, did? And so we asked whether he does see any continuities in this talk with your work on the Baroque. I was, for instance, struck by your reference to the other, but also was wondering how new scholarship on ornament comes into play or not. So whether there's any kind of continuity in methodology or approach, if I understand the question well.
Johan. Of course, there's continuity. No,
I think Johan should get his camera on now, at least become visible. No, right?
You rascal. Um, no, I mean, first of all, in very general terms, on Rickert, obviously it is a way of resisting to read the 18th century as the origin of modernity. And so that is so it is a way of thinking of the 18th century as a century that is still working through much of what was at stake in the 17th century, being a confessional strife, being a society that, if you, it's not the right word, but struggles with the tension between religion and secularization, a society where with very complex and very layered power structures that work both bottom up and top down, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea, which is quite strong in Rickert, so that the 18th century sort of turns its back to the 17th century, looks forward, and then is a kind of prelude to the Enlightenment. I think is something that I'm really challenging. Also, by obviously pointing out in a way a different kind of modernity that is at work in the Rococo. And I'm definitely not alone in doing that. Again, the fact that it's not something that is a kind of degenerate version of what came before, but a kind of new, actually very smart architectural reaction or engagement with these inherited questions, you could say. That is actually something that I want to focus on. And obviously, what I carry from the 17th century into the 18th century is, first of all, the kind of complicated relationship between certain objects and iconographies and architecture, and how basically how these are being framed and dealt with. Secondly, what I want to do, and this is something that is still very much, is again thinking about how literary culture, thinking about metaphor, truth claims in the images, and narratives, the probability of narratives, and so on, how that sort of plays out in this context as well. And then finally, there's also, it's probably something that you have noted, a kind of real interest in thinking about how formal strategies and formal and material strategies are being developed by different kinds of actors in different kinds of contexts to deal with that. Yeah, that's, and what is perhaps new, which is something again. So I think Nikos Magoliotis is listening. Is one of my team. It's a kind of ongoing discussion we have is about the tension between vernacular and high culture, and then how that sort of relates to the kind of international dimension, which for me is refreshing. Obviously, after having been Rome focused for 2 decades, it's a way of opening things up.
I think, yeah, I think we have room for one last question. If one member of the audience still has a pressing question to address to Maarten. If not, then what rests me is to thank Maarten warmly for this absolutely wonderful trip through Bayern with cloudy skies, mist and sun. We've seen it all. Thanks for bringing us to these marvelous churches and getting us acquainted indeed with an uncanny phenomenon. But I think most of it has inspired most of us to go and see them ourselves.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that another thing to hand over to you before we leave this session is that the next excursion at home will be on 3 December, where we will be addressed either in swimming pants or not by Andrew Leach from the beach on Gold Coast. He will talk about that uh, new city along the Australian coast that is often compared to Dubai or even Vegas. And he's promised us to show the sun rising in at the Australian beach. So you're all warmly welcome to join us then again. I suggest, since we don't get to see each other that often now, we officially close now, but we can continue the conversation if you're still up for it, Maarten.
Of course, no, it's,
Normally we would have a reception and have a drink
yeah,
together. I suggest we just do the same, but then on a more informal way. So thank you all for joining tonight, and I hope to see you at the next edition. And thank you, Pierre, for making this. Oh, there's another question. Are you still up for one, Maarten? Or
sure, yeah.
sure, okay. Then my official ending needs to be repeated in a minute. But as said, the decoration on the ceiling is different when entering than when leaving the church. Is there also a difference on the decorations on the door, where it is very easy to use different decorations? So
Yeah,
we've had these questions
very much.
on the windows, and now actually the door as another key element.
Actually, no, it's a very good question, and which I'm sort of searching. I think, I mean, if well, what I'm saying now is very provisional. Doors are actually in general very understated, with the exception of, you could say, the middle, which is often developed as a column. But what is very interesting to look at in these doors are the locks. The locks are incredibly ornate and elaborate, and actually much more on the inside than they are on the outside. And it's actually, you have these rocaille motifs also in the locks. What that means, I'm not sure, but I do think that in a way the door is one of those elements, just like the windows from the outside, that don't want to attract attention to themselves. No? So and also this kind of movement that you see different things when you turn around, when you turn your back to the altar and look up. This is where it needs to happen. This is where you have to sort of be knocked down by the gate of the apocalypse and so on. And I think actually that the moment of entering inside and leaving the building itself is perhaps not something that requires a kind of architectural accent. But it's a very good question. I've never really looked at it, except at the locks, which are fantastic. But I'll keep it in mind.
Oh, there's another one by Jan Mannaert.
Hey, Jan.
Would you see a parallel between the extreme use of the rocaille on all architectural surfaces and the extreme covering of very late German Gothic churches with crazy motifs like branches and leaves?
That's short answer is yes. Jan, yes. No, no, no. I think there is a very first of all, purely historically speaking, there is immediately when rococo and rocaille emerges, a kind of identification of the two. So in the sense that as two styles that thrive on this kind of excessive organic ornament. For instance, Logis does it in a way. And I think what you see with this I mean, you're talking about neo-Gothic, Jan?
Sorry, late German Gothic churches.
Yeah. No,
Late Gothic, yes.
No, and the link is being made very early, but I think, and again, this is a little bit of thin ice. Purely formally, there are clearly parallels. So, and it also makes sense that you have people that you have craftsmen and so on who work in a context where you have these late Gothic churches in a way resonate with them. I do think that there's a kind of, I mean, it's not the right word. Regionalist reflex that works there, the kind of vindication and a kind of development of a regionally bound language, which would incorporate earlier elements that are present. And that's where the ice becomes really thin. I think there are also literally historical continuities in the development of certain ornamental motifs, the kind of grotesque motifs which you also find in Gothic architecture, which then become classicized with the Roman grotesques, and which are then being sort of transformed into rocaille motifs and so on and so forth. So I do think there's a link, and I'm actually I wonder whether there are no examples where the two actually start to fuse, but I couldn't think of one now. So where there's actually kind of no, there is in Eichstätt. There's a very interesting. Eichstätt has a Gothic cathedral, which was completely rococo in the mid 18th century, and obviously when it was restored, all the rocailles, which were literally grafted onto the Gothic structure, was removed, except in one chapel, out of a kind of historical whatever. Sense of shame, I don't know. Okay.
Okay, I'll leave a bit more time, but I think we've been highly demanding on Maarten's energy.
It's okay. No, it's
yeah, the questions are great, so that's always a sign of an inspiring talk, I would say. But then, if no one has a question left, then thank you, Maarten, once again, and I would like to ask Pierre to switch off the recording for this part of the lecture, and then we can continue on a more informal level. Thank you everyone for being present tonight, and hope to see you again on the 3rd of December, another Thursday night at 8 o'clock.